What if saving a life brought you to the edge of losing everything? Dr. Jordan Carter, a talented surgeon, faces a shocking accusation after saving a woman's life. Instead of gratitude, he's hit with a lawsuit claiming negligence and racial bias. As prejudice threatens his career, Jordan must fight not just for his reputation, but for his future. Can he overcome the forces against him, or will prejudice win in the end? Discover the gripping story of courage, resilience, and justice. Subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't miss what happens next. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the hospital corridors. The air was thick with the familiar scent of disinfectant and the steady hum of machinery. In the operating room, the atmosphere was tense, but controlled a delicate balance of urgency and precision. Dr. Jordan Carter stood at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the open abdomen of his patient, his hands moving with steady, practiced expertise. "Vitals are stable," the anesthesiologist called from his post, his eyes glued to the monitors tracking the patient's heart rate and blood pressure. "Good, let's get ready to close," Jordan replied, his voice calm, betraying none of the exhaustion creeping into his body after 12 hours on shift. Sweat beaded along his brow, but his hands remained rock steady. His team moved around him, each member playing their part in the intricate dance of saving a life. Jordan's world narrowed to the task in front of him, the beeping of the machines and the soft murmur of his team fading into the background. There was a particular rhythm to surgery, a flow that, once found, allowed him to tune out everything else. It was one of the reasons he had chosen this path. When he was in the OR, nothing else mattered. Not the long hours, not the pressure, not the scrutiny that followed him as one of the few black surgeons in the hospital. In the operating room, it was just him and the patient, life or death balanced on the edge of a scalpel. "Scalpel," Jordan said, extending his hand. A nurse immediately placed the instrument in his palm. The incision was clean, the surgery progressing smoothly. After what felt like hours but was closer to 45 minutes, Jordan finally stepped back, peeling off his gloves and exhaling slowly. He glanced at the clock, just after 2 a.m. The patient was stable. He had done his part, saved another life, and in a few hours the patient would wake up, never knowing the effort it had taken to keep her alive. "Well done, everyone," Jordan said to the room. His team offered weary but satisfied nods in return. As he left the OR, stripping off his surgical mask, Jordan felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction settle over him. This was what he had trained for, what he had sacrificed so much for. These moments when the hours of preparation, the years of education, all came together to make a difference in someone's life. But as he walked through the hospital's dimly lit corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling of weight on his shoulders. It was always there, lurking in the background, even on nights like this when the surgery had gone perfectly. No matter how skilled he was, no matter how many lives he saved, Jordan knew that for some people, he would always be judged by something beyond his control. By the time Jordan had scrubbed out and made his way to the staff room, his pager buzzed against his hip. He glanced down at the number flashing on the screen. It was the ER. His muscles tensed. With a sigh, he turned on his heel and headed for the emergency department. The hospital never slept, and as one of the senior surgeons on call, neither did Jordan. When he reached the ER, the scene was chaotic but organized, a controlled storm. Nurses hurried between patients, doctors conferred quietly, and the steady chorus of beeping machines filled the air. "Dr. Carter," a nurse called out as she rushed toward him, a clipboard clutched in her hand. Her expression was tight, her body language urgent. "We've got a critical case. Emily Reed, 58 years old, collapsed at her home. It looks like an abdominal rupture. She's losing blood fast." Jordan's mind kicked into high gear, his exhaustion melting away. "What's her blood pressure?" 60 over 40 and dropping, the nurse replied. "Prep her for emergency surgery," Jordan said, already moving toward the ER bay where Emily Reed lay unconscious. "We don't have much time." As they wheeled her toward the OR, Jordan glanced down at the patient. Emily Reed was pale, her lips tinged blue. She was teetering on the edge of shock. Her chart showed a complicated medical history: high blood pressure, diabetes, a few previous surgeries. Not an ideal candidate for an emergency procedure, but there was no choice. Inside the operating room, Jordan quickly scrubbed in, pulling on his gloves and mask as the nurses prepped Emily. He reviewed the scans. A massive abdominal aortic aneurysm, ready to rupture if it hadn't already. "We need to work fast," he said, his tone clipped but steady. The surgery that followed was intense. Hours passed as Jordan and his team worked tirelessly to repair the rupture, carefully navigating the complications that arose due to her underlying conditions. His eyes remained sharp, his focus unyielding as he stitched, clamped, and sutured with precision. At one point, a nurse handed him a towel to wipe the sweat from his brow. Jordan barely acknowledged her, too absorbed in the delicate work in front of him. "BP's rising," the anesthesiologist reported after a tense moment where Jordan wasn't sure they'd be able to stop the bleeding. "She's stabilizing." Jordan exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. He finished closing the incision, taking his time to ensure everything was secure before finally stepping back. "She'll need close monitoring and recovery," he said to the nurses, his voice calm but firm. "But she's going to make it." The weight of the last few hours hit him all at once. Another life saved, but at what cost to him? The toll these surgeries took on his body was significant, but it was nothing compared to the emotional toll that came with being a black doctor in a world where that still mattered to some. As he exited the operating room, peeling off his gloves, his pager buzzed again. "Mrs. Reed is waking up." Emily Reed's recovery room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the hallway casting long shadows over the equipment that surrounded her bed. The rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor was the only sound in the room as Jordan entered, glancing briefly at the chart in his hand before approaching her bed. Emily's eyes fluttered open just as Jordan stepped up to her bedside. She blinked groggily, her face pinched with discomfort. It was a normal reaction after major surgery. Jordan checked her vitals, confirming that her recovery was progressing as expected. "Mrs. Reed," Jordan said softly, his voice calm and professional. "You've just come out of surgery. You had a ruptured aneurysm, but we were able to repair it. You're going to be okay." For a brief moment, Emily's expression was one of confusion, as though she were still piecing together the details of what had happened. Then slowly, her eyes focused on Jordan, and something changed in her gaze. Her face twisted into a sneer, her eyes narrowing with disdain. "You!" she spat, her voice hoarse but sharp. "I want to see the real doctor. Get me someone else." Jordan felt the familiar sting of her words, but he didn't flinch. He had been through this before, more times than he cared to admit. Racism wasn't new to him. It wasn't even surprising. It just came in different packages. "I am your doctor," Jordan said, keeping his voice neutral, though inside the words hit harder than they should have. "I performed your surgery. You're stable now, and we're monitoring your recovery closely." Emily's lips curled in disgust as she pulled the thin hospital blanket tight around her. "I don't believe you," she snapped. "You don't know what you're doing. I don't want you anywhere near me. I want a real doctor. A white doctor." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and filled with venom. Jordan stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed the familiar, painful pattern of this conversation. This woman didn't see him as a doctor, just a black man in a white coat. It didn't matter that he had just saved her life. It didn't matter that he had spent years honing his skills, or that he had operated on countless patients before her, some with conditions even more severe. To her, none of that mattered. "I assure you, Mrs. Reed," Jordan said quietly, maintaining his composure even as the familiar frustration crept in, "you're receiving the best care available, but if you'd like a second opinion, I can arrange for another doctor to review your case." Emily turned her face away, her expression twisted with anger. "I don't want your assurances," she muttered. "I want someone else. Get me the director. I'll make sure they know what you did to me." Jordan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had done everything right. He had saved her life. But none of that mattered to her. She had already made up her mind about him the moment she opened her eyes and saw the color of his skin. "I'll inform the director of your request," Jordan said, his voice steady but tired. He turned and left the room without another word, feeling the familiar pang of frustration as he walked down the hallway. In the hallway, Jordan's footsteps slowed as the full weight of the situation settled on him. He had faced racism before, both subtle and overt, and every time it left a mark, like a scar that never quite healed. No matter how many lives he saved, no matter how much experience he had, there would always be people like Emily Reed who couldn't see past the surface. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The hospital was quiet now, the chaos of the surgery behind him. But inside, Jordan felt a storm brewing. Emily's words echoed in his mind, the sharp sting of her accusations settling in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. It didn't matter that her surgery had been a success. It didn't matter that he had done everything by the book. All that mattered to her was the color of his skin. "Dr. Carter?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Jordan opened his eyes to see a nurse approaching, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Reed is still asking you. She's demanding to speak to the hospital director." Jordan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's not going to let this go," he said, more to himself than to the nurse. He had been here before, too many times. He knew exactly how this would play out. "Tell Dr. Bishop to handle it. She wants the director." The nurse nodded sympathetically, understanding the subtext of his words. She knew what Jordan was going through. The staff had seen it before too, though they rarely spoke about it openly. "I'll let her know." As the nurse walked away, Jordan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering frustration. He had more patients to see, more work to do. He couldn't let Emily Reed get under his skin. But as he walked toward the next patient's room, the weight of her accusations clung to him like a shadow. Later that evening, Jordan sat in Dr. Karen Bishop's office, recounting the events of the day. Karen listened carefully, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, her expression thoughtful. "She's been like this since she woke up," Jordan said, leaning back in his chair, his voice heavy with frustration. "Accusing me of, well, everything really. She doesn't trust me. She thinks I did something wrong because I'm black." Karen nodded slowly, her brow furrowed. "Jordan, we've dealt with patients like this before. Her accusations are unfounded, and you've done everything right. But if she keeps making noise, it could turn into something bigger." Jordan sighed, rubbing his eyes. He knew what Karen was saying. This wasn't just about one patient's outburst. Emily Reed had the potential to cause serious trouble, especially if she escalated her complaints to the hospital administration. I'm tired of this, Karen. I've worked too hard for this. I did everything by the book, and now I'm being questioned because of the color of my skin." Karen's expression softened, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle. "I know, and I hate that you're going through this again. But we're going to handle it. You've got the hospital's full support. We're not going to let one racist patient derail your career." Jordan appreciated her words, but the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. He had been here before, and every time it left him feeling hollow. It didn't matter how many surgeries he performed, how many lives he saved. There would always be someone who saw him as less than. And it wasn't just about Emily Reed. It was about all the others before her, the patients who doubted his abilities, the colleagues who questioned his qualifications, the world that seemed determined to remind him that, in their eyes, he would always be other. "I know the facts are on my side," Jordan said quietly. "I just want to make sure this doesn't spiral into something bigger." "It won't," Karen said firmly. "We've got your back. I'll talk to the administration, and we'll make sure this stays under control. You just focus on your work." Jordan nodded, though the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He trusted Karen. She had always been in his corner, but there was only so much she could do. In the end, this wasn't just about hospital policy or medical competence. This was about something deeper, something that couldn't be solved with facts and figures. As he left Karen's office and walked down the quiet hallway, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next morning, Jordan Carter was in the middle of reviewing patient files when a knock on the door interrupted him. A nurse, Megan, poked her head into his office, her expression uneasy. "Dr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "there's something you should know. Mrs. Reed, she's filed a formal complaint." Jordan looked up from his desk, his heart sinking. He knew this was coming. Ever since Emily Reed had demanded a real doctor, her words laced with venom. He had been bracing for the next blow. He had hoped that she would calm down, that she would let her anger dissipate with time. But it seemed that wasn't the case. A formal complaint? He asked, trying to keep his voice even. Megan nodded, stepping further into the room. She's accusing you of negligence and racial bias. She's saying that you intentionally didn't give her the care she needed because of her race. Jordan let out a slow breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been here before, though not at this level. Patients had questioned his abilities, whispered about his qualifications, but no one had ever escalated it to an official complaint like this. Thanks for letting me know, he said, his voice tight. As Megan left, Jordan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had saved her life. He had done everything right, followed the proper procedures, yet none of that mattered. To Emily Reed, the only thing that mattered was the color of his skin. A formal complaint wasn't just an insult, it was a threat. If her accusations gained traction, they could do real damage to his career. The hospital board would have to take it seriously, and he could face disciplinary action, even if the claims were unfounded. The sheer idea of it made his stomach churn. He had seen it happen to other Black professionals, friends and colleagues who had been sidelined or even pushed out because of false accusations that were easier for hospitals and companies to accept than to fight. And now, it was happening to him. A week passed, and the tension surrounding Emily Reed's complaint continued to grow. Whispers echoed through the hospital halls, and although no one said anything directly to Jordan, he could feel the shift in the air. Nurses gave him sympathetic glances, and some of his colleagues seemed to avoid him altogether, perhaps afraid of being caught in the crossfire of whatever was coming. Jordan tried to focus on his work, throwing himself into his surgeries and patient care, but it was hard to shake the feeling that a storm was brewing, one that could sweep away everything he had worked for. His fears were confirmed when he received a call from the hospital's legal department. They asked him to come in for a meeting regarding Emily Reed's complaint. The tone was neutral, but Jordan could hear the tension in the lawyer's voice. This wasn't just a routine investigation. It was serious. When he arrived at the legal department's office, Elizabeth Daniels, the hospital's lead attorney, greeted him with a professional but concerned expression. Jordan, she said, motioning for him to sit. We need to talk about Emily Reed. Jordan nodded as he sat down, feeling the weight of what was to come. Her formal complaint has escalated, Elizabeth continued, her voice steady but serious. She's hired a lawyer, and they're preparing to file a lawsuit. They're claiming medical negligence and racial discrimination. They're pushing hard, and we're going to have to prepare for a legal battle. Jordan's heart sank. A lawsuit. This was worse than he had feared. Complaints could be handled internally, but a lawsuit would take things public. His reputation would be dragged through the mud, regardless of the outcome. The media could get involved, patients would be afraid to trust him, and his entire career could be at risk. Elizabeth continued, we're going to fight this, but you need to be prepared for a long, drawn-out process. They've hired Tom Richards. He's known for taking on these kinds of cases, especially ones involving racial discrimination. He's going to try to paint a picture of you as someone who intentionally harmed Mrs. Reed because of her race. We'll need to gather every piece of evidence we can to counter that narrative. Jordan nodded, his throat tight. I saved her life, Elizabeth. She was in critical condition. I followed every procedure by the book. I know you did, Elizabeth said firmly, and we're going to prove that. But we need to be ready. This isn't just about the facts. It's about perception. Richards is going to try to exploit her claims to create doubt, and we need to be prepared for that. Jordan leaned back in his chair, feeling the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. A legal battle wasn't just about proving the truth. It was about surviving the attacks, the doubts, and the public scrutiny that would follow. How long do we have? Jordan asked. His voice was low. They'll file the suit within the next few weeks, Elizabeth replied. Once that happens, we'll have to respond immediately. We'll start gathering all the evidence now. Your surgery notes, the patient records, testimonies from the staff who were there. We'll build a solid defense. You've got the hospital's full support, but we need to be ready for a fight. Jordan nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't ease. He had saved her life, but none of that mattered now. This was about something else, something far more insidious. The days after his meeting with Elizabeth were some of the hardest of Jordan's career. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of his mind, the constant fear that everything he had worked for was about to come crashing down. At the hospital, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers had grown louder, and the looks had become more blatant. Some of his colleagues avoided him entirely, while others gave him awkward smiles that did little to mask their discomfort. Even the patients seemed different. A few had started requesting to see other doctors, citing vague concerns about their care. Jordan knew the real reason, though. Word of the lawsuit had started to spread, and it was already doing damage. One evening, after finishing a particularly grueling surgery, Jordan sat alone in the staff lounge, staring at the ceiling. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. He had always known that being a black surgeon in a predominantly white profession would come with challenges. But this was different. This wasn't about subtle biases or microaggressions. This was a full-blown attack on his character, on his very identity as a doctor. The door to the lounge creaked open, and Sarah Phillips, one of the nurses who had worked with Jordan for years, stepped inside. She paused when she saw him, her expression softening with concern. "Hey," she said quietly, walking over to the table. "You okay?" Jordan let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his eyes. "Not really." Sarah sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I heard about the lawsuit," she said gently. "I'm sorry you're going through this." Jordan nodded, though he didn't look up. It's exhausting, you know. I've worked so hard to get here, and now it feels like all of that could be taken away because of one patient's hatred." Sarah's expression was filled with empathy. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I know this isn't fair. You saved her life. Anyone who knows you knows that you're one of the best doctors here. She's just angry, and she's taking it out on you." "I know that," Jordan said, his voice tight, "but it doesn't make it easier. The fact that people are even considering her accusations, it makes me feel like none of the work I've done matters. Like no matter what I do, people will always see me as less than." Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not less than. You've earned your place here. You're one of the best surgeons this hospital has ever had, and no lawsuit is going to change that." Jordan offered a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I don't know how to shake this feeling. It feels like everything is falling apart." "You're not alone," Sarah said firmly. "You've got people here who believe in you, who know the truth. We're going to get through this." "You're going to get through this." Jordan nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. He appreciated Sarah's words, he really did. But it was hard to believe that everything would be okay when his entire career was hanging by a thread. As the legal team began preparing for the lawsuit, Jordan threw himself even deeper into his work. It was the only way he knew how to cope with the stress and uncertainty. Surgery was the one place where he could shut out everything else. The whispers, the looks, the fear of what was coming. In the operating room, it was just him and the patient. Nothing else mattered. But even in surgery, the tension followed him. Every time he scrubbed in, he felt the weight of the lawsuit pressing down on him. His colleagues were polite, but there was a distance now, a subtle shift in the way they interacted with him. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen, waiting to see how the lawsuit would play out before deciding where they stood. Dr. Karen Bishop remained one of his strongest allies, and they spent hours together reviewing the details of Emily Reed's surgery, preparing for the upcoming battle. "Everything checks out," Karen said one afternoon as they sat in her office, reviewing the notes from the surgery. "Your procedure was flawless. The patient records show that she was stabilized after the surgery and that her recovery was progressing normally." Jordan nodded, though his expression remained grim. "It doesn't matter what the facts are. She's not going to care about any of this. She's convinced herself that I did something wrong, and that's all that matters to her." "That's true," Karen said quietly, "but we have the truth on our side. You did everything right, and we're going to prove that." Jordan leaned back in his chair, his hands rubbing his temples. "It's just hard, Karen. No matter how much I've done, No matter how much I've proven myself, it always feels like I have to fight harder than everyone else. Karen's expression softened with sympathy. I know, and I wish I could say that this will be the last time you have to fight. But we both know that's not true. But you're not alone in this. We're all behind you, and we're going to get through this together. Jordan nodded, though the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He knew Karen was right. They had the truth, and they had the evidence. But he also knew that truth wasn't always enough. Sometimes perception matters more than facts. As they wrapped up their meeting, Greg Lawson, the hospital's head of security, knocked on the door. He stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression serious. I've been hearing things, Greg said, crossing his arms. Rumors are starting to spread about the lawsuit. Patients are talking, and it's not good. Jordan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I figured as much. What are they saying? Some patients are concerned about their care, Greg said carefully. They're worried that the lawsuit means something's wrong. A few have even requested to switch doctors. Jordan clenched his jaw, frustration building in his chest. Of course they have. Don't worry, Greg added. We're keeping an eye on the situation. If anyone starts causing trouble, we'll handle it. You just focus on what you do best. Jordan nodded, though the reassurance did little to ease the knot of tension in his chest. The damage was already being done, and it felt like there was nothing he could do to stop it. It didn't take long for news of the lawsuit to spread beyond the walls of the hospital. What started as whispers among staff and patients soon became public knowledge, and within days Jordan found himself at the center of a storm he had no control over. Patients who had once greeted him with smiles and gratitude now looked at him with suspicion. Some requested new doctors, while others whispered among themselves as he passed by. It didn't matter that the lawsuit hadn't been proven. It was enough that the accusations existed. The damage was already done. One afternoon, Jordan was in the hospital cafeteria, grabbing a quick coffee between surgeries, when he overheard a conversation that made his stomach turn. Isn't that the doctor being sued? A woman whispered to her friend, nodding subtly in Jordan's direction. The one they're saying is racist? Yeah, the friend replied, her voice low but clear. I heard he messed up a surgery and then tried to cover it up. Can you believe that? Jordan's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his jaw clenching. He had expected this. He knew that the lawsuit would lead to rumors and misinformation, but hearing it firsthand still stung. Forcing himself to remain calm, Jordan turned and walked away, his chest tight with frustration. No matter how many surgeries he performed flawlessly, no matter how many lives he saved, there would always be people willing to believe the worst about him, and now with the lawsuit looming over his head, it felt like his entire career was under siege. The pressure of the lawsuit didn't just affect Jordan's professional life, it began to seep into his personal relationships as well. Friends and colleagues who had once been a source of support now seemed distant, unsure of how to navigate the storm swirling around him. One evening, Jordan met up with Marcus, a longtime friend and fellow doctor, at a bar downtown. They had always been close, bonding over their shared experiences as Black men in the medical field, but tonight the conversation felt heavy. So, Marcus began after they had settled into their seats, I heard about the lawsuit. How are you holding up? Jordan let out a bitter laugh, taking a sip of his drink. Not great. It feels like everything is falling apart. I saved her life, Marcus, and now she's trying to destroy my career because she doesn't like the fact that I'm Black. Marcus shook his head, his expression grim. That's messed up, man. I can't believe she's doing this to you. You don't deserve this. I know, Jordan said quietly, but it doesn't matter. People are already talking, already doubting me. It feels like no matter how hard I work, no matter how many lives I save, it's never enough. People are always going to see me as just the Black doctor. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes filled with understanding. I get it. We've both dealt with this kind of thing before, but it doesn't make it any easier. The system's stacked against us, and people like her, they're always going to look for a way to tear us down. Jordan nodded, his chest tight with frustration. I just don't know how much more of this I can take. Every day it feels like I'm fighting just to stay afloat. "You're strong, Jordan," Marcus said firmly. "Stronger than you think. You've been through worse, and you've come out on top. This isn't going to take you down." Jordan wanted to believe him, but the weight of the situation was heavy, dragging him down with each passing day. The lawsuit was just the latest in a long line of battles he had fought, but this time it felt different. This time it felt personal. The courthouse was buzzing with activity the morning the trial began. Dr. Jordan Carter stood just outside the courtroom, staring up at the imposing columns, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The legal battle that had been looming for weeks was now a reality, and the stakes couldn't be higher. His entire career was on the line, his reputation hanging by a thread. As Jordan took a deep breath, trying to center himself, Dr. Karen Bishop approached, her heels clicking against the marble floors. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, offering him a small but sincere smile. "You've got this, Jordan," she said, her voice steady. "We've got the truth on our side." Jordan nodded, though the anxiety gnawing at him didn't ease. "I know, I didn't expect it to go this far." Karen gave him a look filled with understanding. "None of us did, but we're going to fight this, and we're going to win." With those words of encouragement, they walked into the courtroom together. Jordan's legal team, led by Elizabeth Daniels, was already seated, reviewing their notes one last time before the proceedings began. Across the room, Jordan's accuser, Emily Reed, sat with her lawyer, Tom Richards, a man known for his aggressive tactics in discrimination cases. His reputation preceded him. He had built a career on twisting narratives to paint defendants as monsters, regardless of the truth. Emily glanced at Jordan as he entered, her face hardening with the same disdain she'd shown in the hospital. Jordan didn't flinch, though inside the anger simmered. She was here to tear him down, to use the color of his skin as a weapon against him, but he wouldn't let her win. The courtroom grew quiet as the judge entered, taking his seat on the bench. The trial began with opening statements, and Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as Tom Richards stood to address the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richards began, pacing slowly in front of them, "we are here today because Mrs. Emily Reed trusted a doctor with her life, and that trust was betrayed. We will prove that Dr. Jordan Carter, in his negligence, not only failed to provide the standard of care expected of a surgeon, but that he did so because of racial bias." Richards's words were sharp, each one designed to sting. He painted a picture of Emily Reed as a victim, a woman who had suffered at the hands of a doctor who had let his prejudice guide his actions. Jordan sat in silence, his fists clenched beneath the table, as Richards spun his web of lies. "Mrs. Reed has endured months of pain and suffering," Richards continued, his voice rising in emotion, "because of the negligence of Dr. Carter. But this isn't just about incompetence. This is about a deeper issue, one that we, as a society, can no longer ignore: racial bias in our medical system." Jordan's stomach twisted as he listened. It was infuriating. He had done everything right. He had saved her life. And now the very system he had fought to excel in was being used against him. When it was time for Elizabeth Daniels to make her opening statement, she stood with the same confidence Jordan had always admired in her. "Members of the jury," Elizabeth began, her voice clear and strong, "what you will hear today is a story based not on facts, but on assumptions and biases. The truth is that Dr. Carter is a highly skilled surgeon who saved Mrs. Reed's life. The evidence will show that he followed every medical procedure to the letter, and that Mrs. Reed's recovery, though difficult, was entirely typical for a surgery of this nature." Elizabeth paced slowly in front of the jury, her tone steady but passionate. "What we are facing here is not a case of malpractice. It is a case of misunderstanding, and quite frankly, prejudice. Mrs. Reed, upon waking from surgery, made judgments about Dr. Carter that had nothing to do with his ability as a doctor and everything to do with the color of his skin." Jordan's heart swelled with gratitude as Elizabeth spoke, her words a balm to the pain of hearing Richard's accusations. She was fighting for him, and she was doing it with grace and conviction. "This is not a case of negligence," Elizabeth concluded. "This is a case of a doctor who did his job, and did it well. We ask that you let the evidence, not assumptions, guide your judgment." With the opening statements complete, the real battle began. The days that followed were grueling. Witness after witness took the stand. Each side presented their version of the truth. Emily Reed spoke first, her voice shaky but filled with indignation as she recounted her version of events. "I woke up in the hospital," Emily said, her voice rising with emotion, "and the first thing I saw was Dr. Carter standing over me. I immediately knew something was wrong. I felt pain, more pain than I had ever felt in my life, and I knew he hadn't done his job right." Tom Richards nodded encouragingly from his seat beside her, and Emily continued, her eyes flashing with anger. "I asked for a second opinion. I asked for someone else to look at me. But they wouldn't listen. They kept saying, 'Doctor.' Carter had done everything right, but I didn't believe them. How could I? I knew in my gut that something was wrong." Jordan sat at the defense table, his heart heavy as he listened to her accusations. He had done everything right, and yet she was painting him as a villain, a negligent surgeon who had intentionally hurt her. It was maddening, but more than that, it was painful. When Tom Richards began his cross-examination of Emily, he wasted no time leading her down a path that made Jordan's stomach turn. "Mrs. Reed," Richards said, his voice smooth, "you mentioned that you felt something was wrong the moment you saw Dr. Carter. Can you explain why?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I just didn't trust him. He didn't look like the kind of doctor I was used to." Richards pressed on, his tone calculated. "And by that, you mean?" Emily's face flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. "I mean, he wasn't the kind of doctor I wanted. I didn't feel comfortable with him." Richards turned to the jury, his expression serious. "And that discomfort, that lack of trust, you believe, was validated by the pain you experienced after the surgery?" "Yes," Emily said firmly. "I know he did something wrong. I can feel it." It was all Jordan could do to remain silent, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Emily's feeling was being presented as fact, as if her discomfort alone was enough to prove negligence. It was absurd, but it was also terrifying, because in cases like this, perception often matters more than the truth. Finally, it was Jordan's turn to take the stand. As he sat in the witness chair facing the jury, he felt the weight of their eyes on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was his chance to tell his side of the story, to show them who he really was. Elizabeth Daniels stood before him, her expression calm and supportive. "Dr. Carter, can you walk us through the surgery you performed on Mrs. Reed?" Jordan nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Mrs. Reed was brought into the ER with a ruptured abdominal aorta. It's a life-threatening condition, and without immediate surgery, she would have died. The operation was complex, but I followed all standard procedures. We were able to repair the rupture, and Mrs. Reed was stabilized." Elizabeth nodded. "And did you at any point act negligently during the surgery or her post-operative care?" "Absolutely not," Jordan replied firmly. "I treated Mrs. Reed with the same level of care and professionalism that I give all my patients. My priority was to save her life, and I did that." Elizabeth turned to the jury, letting his words sink in. "Thank you, Dr. Carter." But then came the cross-examination. Tom Richards approached the stand, his expression cool and calculated. "Dr. Carter," he began, "you claim that you followed all standard procedures during Mrs. Reed's surgery. But isn't it true that she experienced significant pain after the operation?" "Pain is a normal part of recovery after a major surgery," Jordan explained, "especially a surgery as invasive as the one Mrs. Reed underwent. We managed her pain with medication, but some discomfort is unavoidable." Richards nodded, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But Mrs. Reed claims that her pain was extreme, more than she had ever felt before. Could it be that you didn't properly manage her post-operative care?" Jordan met Richards' gaze, refusing to back down. "Her recovery was difficult, but it was in line with what we would expect for surgery of this nature. I monitored her condition closely, and at no point did I believe she was in any danger." Richards pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "But she didn't believe you, did she? She requested a second opinion, which you denied." "I didn't deny her a second opinion," Jordan said evenly. I told her that if she wanted another doctor to review her case, I would arrange it. But medically, there was no indication that anything had gone wrong. Richards paused, his eyes narrowing. Mrs. Reed claims that she felt something was wrong the moment she saw you. Do you believe that her discomfort was unfounded? Jordan hesitated for a split second, choosing his words carefully. I believe that Mrs. Reed's discomfort was not based on the medical care she received. It was based on her assumptions about me as a doctor. And what assumptions are those? Richards asked, his voice was low. Jordan met his gaze, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. She made judgments about me based on the color of my skin. The courtroom fell silent. The jury watched him closely, their expressions unreadable. This was the heart of the matter, the racism that had driven Emily Reed's accusations. It was a painful truth, but it was a truth that needed to be spoken. Jordan's words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and undeniable. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, and even Tom Richards seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw honesty of Jordan's statement. Jordan took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of the moment, but also the relief of finally addressing the issue head-on. This trial wasn't just about medical competence. It was about race. It had always been about race, and for too long, he had let it go unspoken. Turning to the judge, then the jury, Jordan continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I have spent my entire career fighting to be the best surgeon I can be. I've saved lives, I've helped countless patients, and I've worked just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else in this room to prove that I belong here. But no matter how skilled I am, no matter how many lives I save, there will always be people who judge me not by my abilities, but by the color of my skin. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The jury watched him intently, their expressions more engaged now, more sympathetic. Mrs. Reed woke up from surgery and saw me, a black man, and she immediately assumed that something was wrong, not because of the surgery I performed, but because of who I am. She didn't trust me because of the color of my skin, and that's what this case is really about. Tom Richards shifted uncomfortably at the plaintiff's table, and Jordan could see the tension in Emily Reed's expression as well. She wasn't used to being called out like this, her bias laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't fail Mrs. Reed as a doctor, Jordan continued, his voice strong. I saved her life, but she has failed me, and she has failed to see me for who I really am. Not a black doctor, but a surgeon who did his job and did it well. The silence that followed was deafening. Jordan could feel the eyes of the jury on him, some filled with understanding, others with guilt. The judge remained stoic, but there was a shift in the room, a crack in the carefully constructed narrative that Tom Richards had been building. Elizabeth Daniels gave Jordan a small nod from the defense table, her expression filled with pride. He had done what needed to be done. He had spoken the truth. As Jordan left the stand and returned to his seat, his heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea how the jury would respond, how the case would play out, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace. He had told his story, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Jordan sat in the courtroom, surrounded by his legal team, but the anxiety was suffocating. He tried to distract himself by focusing on his work, reading patient files and preparing for upcoming surgeries. But his mind kept drifting back to the trial. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed was at stake. The fear of losing it all weighed heavily on him, but there was also a sense of calm and quiet confidence that the truth would prevail. After hours of waiting, the courtroom finally buzzed with activity. The jury was returning with their verdict. Jordan's heart pounded as the jury filed back into the room. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood with a piece of paper in her hand. The entire courtroom held its breath as the judge asked for the verdict. In the case of Emily Reed versus Dr. Jordan Carter and this hospital, the foreman began, her voice steady, we find the defendant not guilty of medical negligence and not guilty of racial discrimination. The words hit Jordan like a wave, flooding him with relief so intense it almost took his breath away. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the verdict sink in. He had won. He had been vindicated. The truth had prevailed. Beside him, Elizabeth Daniels gave him a triumphant smile, and Dr. Karen Bishop squeezed his shoulder in quiet congratulations. The hospital had stood by him, and now justice had been served. But as Jordan looked across the room, his eyes landed on Emily Reed. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she processed the outcome. Tom Richards was already gathering his papers, his expression tight with frustration. The battle was over, but for Emily it didn't feel like a defeat, only a temporary setback. As the courtroom began to clear, Jordan stood, feeling the tension in his chest slowly ease. He had won the legal battle, but the scars of the experience would remain. The lawsuit had been a personal attack, not just on his abilities as a doctor, but on his very identity. And while he had emerged victorious, the pain of being judged for his race still lingered. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city. Jordan stood for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. The storm had passed, but the damage it had left behind would take time to heal. The courthouse doors closed behind Jordan with a heavy thud, and the noise seemed to echo in his chest. He stood on the steps, watching as people filed out, murmuring to one another about the trial. Some glanced at him, others hurried past, eager to leave the intensity of the courtroom behind. But for Jordan, there was no escape. The trial was over, and he had won, but the victory felt hollow. The weight of everything that had transpired pressed down on him. He had proven his innocence, but the fight had taken something from him, something intangible, but deeply felt. He knew that this case would leave a mark, not just on his career, but on him as a person. Beside him, Dr. Karen Bishop stopped and gave him a gentle smile. "You did it," she said softly, her voice full of pride. Jordan nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. "It's over," he said, though the words felt heavier than they should have. He had imagined this moment so many times, the relief of hearing the verdict, the sense of closure. But now, standing here, he realized that the scars ran deeper than the case itself. They were about something bigger than Emily Reed's accusations. This trial had unearthed years of unspoken battles, the quiet moments of prejudice he had faced in his career, the constant need to prove himself. Karen studied his face, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I know it doesn't feel like a victory right now," she said gently, "but you fought this battle, and you came out on top. That matters, Jordan. You showed everyone what kind of doctor you are." Jordan appreciated her words, but he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. He had spent years honing his craft, working tirelessly to build a reputation as one of the best surgeons in the hospital. And yet, with one patient's biased accusation, everything had been called into question. Have I thought this would feel different?" Jordan admitted, his voice low. "I thought winning would mean something more." "It does mean something," Karen insisted, her voice firm but kind. "But I know it's not the kind of victory you wanted. The truth is, people like Emily Reed will always exist. There will always be someone waiting to tear you down because of the color of your skin. But you're still here. You're still standing. And that's a victory in itself." Jordan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He had survived this battle, but it wasn't the end of the war. There would always be more challenges, more people like Emily Reed. But he had proven something to himself today, that he could fight back and still hold his head high. A few weeks passed, and the storm surrounding the lawsuit began to calm. The hospital slowly returned to its regular rhythm, the whispers fading as new stories and new crises took center stage. But for Jordan, the fallout lingered. Some of his colleagues treated him the same as before, but others seemed to hold back, their trust in him somehow diminished by the very fact that the lawsuit had happened, regardless of its outcome. One afternoon, Jordan was in his office reviewing patient files when there was a knock on the door. He looked up to see Greg Lawson, the hospital's head of security, standing in the doorway. "Hey, Doc," Greg said, stepping inside. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Jordan replied, motioning for him to sit. "What's up?" Greg sat down, his expression serious. "I just wanted to check in on you. I know the trial's over, but I also know that doesn't mean everything goes back to normal." Jordan appreciated the concern. "Yeah, things are better, I guess, but it's not like I can just forget about everything that happened." Greg nodded. I get that. You went through hell, and I've seen how some people around here are treating you, like they're not sure what to believe, even after the verdict. Jordan sighed, leaning back in his chair. That's the hardest part. Even with the truth out there, people still doubt me. It feels like no matter how many times I prove myself, it's never enough. Greg studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice serious but encouraging. Look, you've been through a rough patch, no doubt, but you've also shown everyone what you're made of. You didn't let them tear you down, and that says a lot. Don't forget that you've got people in your corner. I've got your back, the hospital's got your back, and most importantly, you've got your own back. Jordan smiled faintly, appreciating the sentiment. Thanks, Greg. That means a lot. Greg stood, giving him a firm pat on the shoulder. You're one of the best, Doc. Don't let anyone make you forget that. As Greg left the office, Jordan sat in the quiet, letting the words sink in. He had fought hard to get here, and even though the scars of the lawsuit were still fresh, he wasn't about to give up. Greg was right, he had survived, and that was something to be proud of. It was an unseasonably cold morning when Jordan saw Emily Reed's name on his patient list again. He had thought their paths would never cross after the trial, but fate had other plans. Emily had been admitted for complications related to her health, and once again, Jordan was the doctor assigned to her case. His stomach twisted as he reviewed her chart, a mix of frustration and dread bubbling up inside him. After everything she had put him through, after the lies, the accusations, the lawsuit, he was expected to treat her again. It felt like a cruel joke, like the universe was testing him to see if he would falter. For a moment, he considered passing the case off to another doctor. After all, no one would blame him for refusing to treat her. But deep down, Jordan knew that wasn't who he was. He was a surgeon, a healer. He had taken an oath to care for all patients, regardless of who they were or what they had done. And as much as he resented Emily for the pain she had caused him, he couldn't let that get in the way of his duty. With a deep breath, Jordan made his way to Emily's hospital room. The air felt heavy as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Emily was sitting up in bed, looking frail and tired. Her face was pale and her eyes were dull. But the moment she saw Jordan, her expression hardened. She shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "You," she muttered, her voice weak but filled with disdain. "Why are you here?" Jordan didn't flinch, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here because you need medical attention, Mrs. Reed. I'm your doctor, and I'm going to make sure you get the care you need." Emily scowled, turning her face away from him. "I don't want you touching me." Jordan took a deep breath, suppressing the frustration that threatened to rise. "I understand that you don't want me here, but your health is my priority. You're experiencing complications, and I'm the best person to handle your case." For a moment, Emily didn't respond. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Then in a voice so soft Jordan almost didn't hear it, she said, "I didn't think I'd see you again." Jordan paused, unsure how to respond. The bitterness in her voice had dulled, replaced by something more complicated. Regret, perhaps, or even shame. But he wasn't here to hash out old wounds. "You're in my care again, Mrs. Reed," Jordan said, keeping his tone professional. "Let's focus on getting you healthy." Emily didn't argue further. Whether it was because she was too tired to fight or because she realized she had no other option, Jordan didn't know. But he did what he always did. He provided the best care possible. Emily's second surgery went smoothly. Jordan worked with the same precision and skill he always brought to the operating room, his focus unshaken despite the personal history between them. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment, not when someone's life was in his hands. After the surgery, as Emily lay in recovery, Jordan allowed himself a moment to breathe. It had been one of the hardest things he had ever done. Operating on a patient who had tried to ruin him, who had seen him as less than human. But he had done it. He had upheld his oath, and in doing so, he had proven something to himself. Later that day, Jordan visited Emily in her room to check on her progress. She was awake, looking slightly better, though her expression was still guarded. When Jordan stepped inside, Emily's eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment, there was silence between them. "How are you feeling?" Jordan asked, keeping his tone neutral. Emily hesitated, her hands twisting the edge of her blanket, Better, she muttered, though her voice lacked the usual hostility. Jordan nodded, checking her vitals. Your recovery is going well. You should be able to go home soon. Emily didn't respond at first. She stared at the ceiling, her expression tense before finally speaking. I didn't think you'd help me again. Not after everything. Jordan paused, looking at her carefully. I'm your doctor, Mrs. Reed. My job is to help you, regardless of what happened in the past. Emily swallowed hard, her face pale. I know you hate me. Jordan's chest tightened. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. He didn't hate her, but the resentment was there, buried under layers of professionalism. I don't hate you, he said finally, his voice steady. But what you did, it hurt. It hurt me deeply. Emily's lips tightened, and she looked away, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. I thought I was right. I thought you... I don't know. I didn't trust you. Jordan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. You judged me before you knew me. You made assumptions based on what I looked like, not on who I was. Emily's eyes glistened with something, tears perhaps, or just exhaustion. I know that now, but I can't take it back. No, Jordan said quietly. You can't. For a long moment, they sat in silence. There was no apology, no grand gesture of forgiveness. But in that quiet moment, there was an understanding, of the damage done and the scars left behind. Jordan stood to leave, glancing back at her one last time. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Reed. Emily didn't respond, but as Jordan left the room, he felt a sense of closure. It wasn't the kind of closure he had expected. There were no apologies, no redemption. But it was enough. He had done his job, and he had walked away with his integrity intact. Months passed, and the events of the trial slowly faded into the background. Jordan's life returned to its normal rhythm, though the experience had changed him. He had always known that being a black doctor came with its own set of challenges, but the lawsuit had brought those challenges into sharp focus. It forced him to confront the biases that still existed in the world around him and within the people he treated. But it had also taught him something important. It had shown him that he could fight back, that he could stand tall in the face of prejudice and emerge stronger for it. The scars would always be there, but they were a testament to his resilience, not his weakness. One evening, Jordan found himself sitting in his office, staring out at the city skyline as the sun set over the horizon. The warm glow of the fading light filled the room, casting everything in a soft, golden hue. He thought about everything that had happened, about the trial, about Emily Reed, about the battles he had fought to get to where he was. And as he sat there, he realized that, despite everything, he had come out on the other side. He had survived. He had proven himself, not just to the world, but to himself. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Dr. Karen Bishop stepped inside, holding a file in her hands. Hey, I just wanted to check in, she said, giving him a warm smile. How are you holding up? Jordan smiled, feeling a sense of peace settled over him. I'm doing okay, Karen. Better, actually. Karen studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. I'm glad to hear that. You've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't been easy. Jordan nodded, his eyes drifting back to the skyline. It hasn't, but I think I'm finally starting to move on. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about learning from it and becoming stronger because of it. Karen smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You've always been strong, Jordan. Don't ever doubt that. As she left, Jordan sat back in his chair, letting her words wash over him. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would always be people like Emily Reed, always more battles to fight. But now he knew he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced the storm and came through it stronger. And as he watched the last rays of sunlight fade into the night, Jordan Carter knew that, no matter what happened, he would keep standing tall. As Jordan Carter gazed out over the city skyline, the weight of the past months finally began to lift. The battles he had fought, the pain he had endured, it had all made him stronger, more determined to keep moving forward. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he was ready. No matter what came next, he would continue to stand tall. Thank you for joining Jordan Carter's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Stay tuned for more powerful stories filled with emotional depth, resilience, and the power to overcome adversity. There's always another story waiting to be told, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Subscribe now and never miss the next chapter.